epic. Today's read aloud is, drum roll, Bread for Words, a Fredrick Douglas story. It's written by Shauna Keller and it is illustrated by Kayla Stark. Now I'm really excited about this one, so let's get started. Bread for Words, a Fredrick Douglas story, written by Shauna Keller, illustrated by Kayla Stark. I know where I was born, not when. It was Tuckahoe, Maryland. I lived free as a bird, near the bay, in a small cabin with Grandma. There wasn't a whole lot to do inside our cramped cabin, so I called to the birds, the frogs, the cats, and the dogs. I chirped and barked and squabbled until even the animals couldn't tell if I was one of their own. One day, Grandma told me I would have to leave. Why? I asked. We belong to Old Master, she said. We are slaves. What does that mean? I thought I belonged to Grandma. They won't teach you a thing but to work, and you won't have a choice. But why am I a slave? I did not want to be told when to work, where to work, how to work, and not have a choice. Grandma was silent on the day we left the cabin early in the morning. We walked 12 long miles on a day swamped with heat and bugs to a place called the Great House Farm. When we arrived, children ran out to see me. They surrounded me, laughing and teasing me so. When Grandma left without saying goodbye, I met my brothers and sisters at the great house, but I didn't know them well. Without Grandma, I was too sad to play. Then I met Daniel. He lived in the great house. We hunted and hiked and fished together. Daniel occasionally shared his cakes with me. He showed me the great house and all the grand rooms inside, including his. Except for the color of our skin, it was hard to know why we were different. Daniel was not a slave. He wasn't born into it. At night, Daniel slept in a warm bed with a full belly. I had no bed. On the coldest nights, I slept with a bag used to carry corn. It wasn't long enough to cover my feet, so I put it over my head. I didn't have enough to eat or enough clothes to stay warm. I didn't even know my age, but Daniel knew his. When his tutor came, he taught Daniel to read and write and speak. I wanted to learn too, but Grandma was right. They didn't give me a choice. I was not old enough to work in the field. I was told to clean the yards, keep the birds out of the garden, and drive the cows. No matter how bad I wanted to learn to read and write, they wouldn't teach me a thing. It was illegal, they said, unlawful, unsafe. Why? I walked like them. I talked like them. I walked and talked exactly like them. I showed them I could. Is that why I was sent to Baltimore, far away from my brothers and sisters? I left the plantation the same way Grandma did, without saying goodbye. In Baltimore, I lived with Mr. Hugh Old, kin to Old Master, and his wife, Mrs. Sophia. I was told to take care of little Thomas, their young son. City life was different from plantation life. There was plenty of food for me to eat and warm, clean clothes for me to wear. At night, I now had a good straw bed with covers. Mrs. Sophia was kind at first. She knew as little of slavery as I did. When she read to Thomas from the Bible, I followed along. To my surprise, she taught me what no one else would, my ABCs. She taught me how to spell next, and I felt proud to know 3- and 4-letter words. She was proud of me too, but when Mr. Auld saw what I could do, anger got a hold of him. He should know nothing but to do what he's told, he said. If you teach Freddie how to read, there will be no keeping him. He forbade Mrs. Sophia from teaching me. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. If I learned to read, I could loosen the chains of bondage. I couldn't give up, but how would I learn now that I had lost my teacher? As Thomas grew older, I was told to carry his books and walk him to school. An idea came to me. I met a lot of hungry boys on the streets. The boys were between 9 and 12 years old. Was I as old as them? I remember how I hated the pinches of hunger in my belly. This time, my hunger was different from theirs. When I was sent on errands, I always took my book with me, and I took extra bread. When I saw the boys on the streets, I offered them bread for words. It worked. With their help, at different times and in different places, I finally learned to read. But to break free from slavery, I knew I had to learn how to write next. A new idea came to me in the shipyard. I watched the ship carpenters carve letters into pieces of wood to show which part of the ship it would be used for. I soon learned the names of these letters. They carved L for larboard or left side, F for forward, S for starboard, the right side, and A for aft, stern. With a lump of chalk, I wrote on fences, brick walls, and pavement. I copied these 4 letters until I could write them from memory. To learn the rest of the alphabet, I challenged those boys on the street who I knew could write. I said I could write as well as them. They didn't believe me. I carefully wrote the letters I had practiced. Beat that. Unable to resist my game, they wrote the letters they knew. I paid close attention to the ones I didn't. At home, when Thomas finished with his copybooks, they were set aside and forgotten. I used the books to trace the letters again and again until I could make them all without looking at the books. After nearly 7 years, I finally succeeded in learning how to read and write. Mr. Auld was right. There would be no keeping me. My chains had been broken. I'm going to read a little bit more about Fredrick Douglas and his life. In 1818, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, who later in life changed his name to Fredrick Douglas to avoid capture, was born enslaved in Talbot County, Maryland. When he was nearly 6 years old, Frederick, like his kin before him, was sent to live and work at the Y Plantation, also called the Great House Farm or Y House, a massive enterprise owned by Colonel Edward Lloyd. Colonel Lloyd employed Aaron Anthony, the head overseer who enslaved Fredrick and his family. On the Y plantation, Fredrick witnessed and experienced physical abuse, neglect, and humiliation. Children had little more than shirts to wear. Even the knowledge of their age and birth date was kept from them. Amid this misery, Fredrick met Daniel, one of Colonel Lloyd's sons. Daniel took Douglas under his wing and at times shared his food with him. Fredrick found another ally in Lucretia Anthony Aloud, Aaron Anthony's daughter. Fredrick ran errands for her, and in return, she provided him with extra bread to eat. Several years after his arrival at the Wyatt plantation, Fredrick was sent to live and work for Lucretia's brother-in-law, Hugh Aloud, and his wife, Sophia. In Baltimore, Fredrick's lifestyle drastically changed. Sophia introduced Fredrick to reading. Charmed by his ability to spell 3- and 4-letter words, she had Fredrick show his skills to her husband. Appalled, Hugh scolded his wife and inadvertently presented Fredrick with his first anti-slavery speech. Sadly, Sophia turned against Fredrick and opposed his education with even more fervor than her husband. Despite the dire warning and outright forbiddance from the Alouds, young Fredrick, who yearned for freedom and understood that education and slavery were incompatible with each other, continued his lesson. Unlike his previous home, the Alouds had plenty of food for Fredrick to eat. No stranger to starvation, Fredrick took bread with him on errands and offered it to the boys he met on the streets in exchange for lessons. Once he mastered reading, Fredrick played games that challenged the boys to write in front of him. He observed them carefully, memorizing their technique. It took him many years to learn, but he never gave up. Several years after finally escaping to the North in 1838, Fredrick lectured as an abolitionist. He wrote countless speeches, worked for anti-slavery papers before he started his own, and penned 3 autobiographies. Undeterred by assault, injury, or intimidation, Fredrick Douglass became a magnificent orator, author, educator, and human rights activist. He died a free man in 1895. Now the author's note says, as a child, I grew up with very little exposure to African American history. It wasn't until high school that I first learned about Fredrick Douglass. As an adult, I revisited his life and was amazed by his tenacity to teach himself how to read and write, considering all the challenges he faced. When crafting this story, it was important to me that young readers had access to Fredrick's own works and that the overall events remained true to his descriptions. Fredrick's full and partial quotes within the story are indicated in bold type, the majority of which come from his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Fredrick Douglass, an American Slave. Despite the discrepancies in his 3 autobiographies, I stuck as close to Fredrick's ideology and terminology as possible, while also considering questions children of that age and in that era would most likely have asked. Thus, I was inspired to write in first person, honoring the legacy of his autobiographies, and present his soulful question, why am I a slave? Early on in the story. It is also why I kept his verbiage intact when using the term slave, as Douglas did, rather than enslaved, as many historians and educators do today, and rightly so, as it demonstrates that slavery was enforced and not voluntary. At the end, I reused the powerful quote, there would be no keeping him, and exchanged the word him with me on page 29 to emphasize Fredrick's determination and mark that moment as he did as a grand achievement that set him on the path to freedom and the pursuit of equality. Now, this is not going to be the last time this year that we talk about Fredrick Douglass and his life. So I just wanted to introduce his story to you now, and I want you to just think, what lessons do you think that you can learn from Fredrick Douglass and his story?